Dante has always been one of the strongest Warframes ever since his release. However, in the latest update, he not only received a cool new skin, but also a quite interesting new augment. So, in this Warframe guide, we're gonna go over Dante in 2026 with multiple updated, very strong builds. Big shout out to all our generous channel members who helped me keep the lights on, and now, let's jump right into it. Alright, so before we get into the skills, I have to make a little bit of an apology. If this video sounds like I'm tired with a lot of background noise, then that's because I'm tired with a lot of background noise. Like, in Germany, we currently have a crazy heat wave going on, and without the AC running in the background, there would be no way this voiceover could ever happen. So yeah, hope you don't mind a little bit of background noise too much, but with that being said, let's take a look at Dante's skills. Let's start out with the passive, and this is actually very ridiculously strong. Dante, as we probably know, has an exalted weapon called Noctua. This is a tome-type weapon, a magic book, and it is an exalted weapon the same way that other Warframes also have exalted weapons. We're gonna talk more about it in just a minute. The important part for the passive here though is that whenever you take out an enemy with the Noctua, you will passively scan that enemy into your codex. Every kill equates to 1 codex scan, and the kicker here is that against every enemy that is fully scanned in your codex, Dante's equipped weapons, including the Noctua itself, will have a 50% higher status chance against those foes. This status chance though is a final modifier and therefore multiplicative after all other status chance effects or buffs. This is very, very strong. Dante's first ability is called Noctua, because, it is the skill that you activate in order to pull out your exalted weapon, well, the Noctua. And for this skill, there is quite a lot to go over, so let's start step by step. First of all, like I said, the Noctua is a fully moddable exalted weapon, just like all the other exalteds. You can apply mods, you can apply arcanes, and it is considered a secondary weapon. Being a tome-type weapon, that means it has access to tome-exclusive mods, and the kicker with the Noctua is that unlike the Grimoire, you can't only use one invocation or canticle mod. Nope, if you wanted to, you could slap on all the tome mods in the game at once. I personally don't think that this is the optimal solution here, but hey, you do you, and if you see a fun synergy, then you absolutely could. As for how the weapon works, it's actually pretty straightforward. When you fire it, then you shoot out a sort of magic bolt that, upon contact with an enemy, will split up into 4 smaller bolts that will fan out in a sort of cone shape in the direction of travel. The cool thing about this exalted weapon though is that unlike most other exalteds, it is not really a channeled ability. See, when you pull it out, you do not consume energy over time. The Noctua only takes up energy for every cast. This is very cool because it means that you can have it out but still benefit from energy regeneration over time effects, which is something that other exalteds can't do. Now, when it comes to the weapon stats, I don't really want to go all that deep into it because it's just, a standard very nice stat weapon. You have high crit chance, decent crit multiplier, high status chance. Like, what I'm trying to say is, you can definitely build this thing into dealing a lot of damage. Now, the Noctua also has an alt-fire, which kinda sorta works like the Arca Plasmor projectile and is very, very strong, but other than that, there is not really much to say about it. Usually you only use this to trigger any buffs from like tome-type mods that rely on the alt-fire being used. But when we're talking about the Noctua, we also need to talk about the brand new augment that came with the last update called Noctua Swarm. What this one does is, whenever you use your alt-fire, then at the point where the alt-fire projectile makes impact, you create an 8-meter AoE in which little bird-like book creatures will start attacking all the enemies that get into said AoE. For every enemy affected then, you and allies in range will regenerate 2 energy per second per enemy. This whole effect is capped at a maximum of 20 energy per second with 10 enemies in the zone. All in all, this augment is mainly an energy regeneration tool. Yes, these little Pageflight thingies do inflict damage, but it's not really worth mentioning. What I personally find a little bit disappointing though is that this augment basically scales with nothing. If you have more ability strength, you're not getting more energy out of it. If you have more ability range, you're not getting a bigger AoE effect from this. Still though, I would say in a mission with high enemy density, it is a very strong tool for your energy economy. So let's talk about his second skill, Light Verse. This one is very short and straightforward. You draw a circle on screen, and then you and allies in range get a little bit of overguard. Also, you heal a portion of your maximum health, which might be nice for your allies, depending on which Warframes they're playing. However, for Dante himself, let me just say usually his health does not really get scratched anyway. And yeah, that's already it. There's not more to it. Ability number 3 is called Dark Verse, and also this one is very quick and straightforward. When you cast this, Dante is going to create 2 strokes with his quill in an X shape on screen. Enemies in a cone in front of you will take slash damage with a guaranteed status effect for both of these strokes. And yeah, also here, that's it. Only important thing to mention would be that this Dark Verse cast does have line of sight requirement, so you cannot hit enemies through walls. At least, not anymore. Alright, let's talk about Dante's fourth ability, Final Verse. If you've been wondering why his second and third ability are so minuscule and bare bones, this is the reason why. First of all, in the bottom right corner of the screen, I'm sure you already noticed this little book symbol. This is very important for Final Verse. What it does is, it records the order in which you casted the last 2 instances of either your light or your dark verse. So, in other words, this book can show 4 different combinations: light light, dark dark, dark light, and light dark. Now, what does this have to do with Final Verse? Well, it's actually pretty simple. You can only cast Final Verse if the book is full with 2 pages. And depending on which of these 4 combinations you made, Final Verse is gonna have a completely different effect. So, let's go over them. Let's start out with Triumph. This one you get when you cast 2 light verses and then activate the Final Verse. What Triumph does is basically a supercharged version of the light verse itself. You get a bigger portion of overguard, but the main selling point here is that you also get overguard regeneration. To be more precise, for every kill and assist that you make with your weapons or abilities, you will then start continuously regenerating overguard over time for a couple of seconds. This is actually incredibly freaking busted because this overguard regeneration is basically like Arcane Aegis. It does not stop no matter what happens, so even if your overguard completely breaks, it will still continuously regenerate and therefore keep you in a constant overguard gate situation. Oh yeah, and by the way, if I say you, then that includes Dante himself as well as allies in range. They get the entire effect as well. So, long story short, Triumph is something you should always activate at the beginning of the mission to keep the entire team alive. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the double dark verse, which is called Tragedy. You will deal a bigger portion of slash damage to all enemies in range. However, also here, the main selling point is something else. Because what Tragedy does is, it takes a look at all slash, heat, and toxin damage over time effects that are on the affected enemies, then calculates how much more damage over time that would deal to them, and then just pops all those DOT effects as one big damage number with an additional damage multiplier. This is very nice in combination with the 2 dark verses that you had to trigger in order to even be able to use Tragedy, because that means all the slashes that you already inflicted will basically be blown up in a big nuke. Okay, now it gets a little bit more interesting with Wordwarden, the third possible combination, which you get by light and then dark verse in that order. When you activate Wordwarden, what happens is you summon a little Noctua companion that's gonna float next to you for a while. Whenever you attack enemies with your weapons, that Noctua companion is gonna fire in sync with you, dealing a portion of the damage that your actual Noctua, your exalted weapon, would deal. This Wordwarden Noctua does take into account most of your build that you have on your actual exalted Noctua, however, there are a couple differences. First of all, the projectile from the Wordwarden is not affected by multi-shot. Also, fire rate bonuses do not apply, it's just set at 3. And also, it will not use the Noctua alt-fire, and it will not trigger any invocation or canticle mods. However, if you modded your Noctua for electricity, then it can still trigger Archon Shards as well as secondary encumber. However though, what is very nice, this Wordwarden also benefits from the added status chance from your passive against fully scanned enemies, plus it can also passively scan enemies into your codex. It's overall a pretty strong ability. And last but not least, we would have Pageflight, which you get with Dark and then Light Verse. When you cast this one, you summon 3 Paragrams. These are like flying birdies, which will seek out nearby enemies and start attacking them. The first thing here to mention is that these Paragrams have higher threat level. That means they will distract the enemies quite a bit, which is nice. The damage, however, that they deal to the enemy isn't really worth mentioning, so I'm not going to get into that. However, they apply 2 very, very broken strong debuffs to every enemy that they attack. To be more precise, they will get status chance as well as status damage vulnerability. Both of these effects are multiplicative to your weapon status chance as well as your status damage. This is incredibly strong not only for weapon platform playstyles, but also for your Dark Verse caster playstyle, because these 2 debuffs with the status vulnerability, that also helps with the slashes that you inflict with your Dark Verse and your Tragedy. And as always, if you could leave a quick like for the video, that would be very nice because it always helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm. So cheers so much for your support. Okay, before we get into the builds themselves, let me quickly explain how we're gonna do this. With Dante, more like with other Exalted Warframes, which Noctua build you choose is very strongly depending on what you make with Dante. So the way I'm gonna organize it is basically in one pack. I'm gonna give you the Dante build, and then I'm gonna give you the corresponding Noctua build. This way you know exactly which Noctua goes with which Dante. Let's start out by talking about the Helminth options though, and this chapter is gonna be a very short one, because Dante is severely limited in any type of Helminth business. See, given that his 2nd, 3rd, and 4th ability are so codependent on one another, that means you kinda sorta just can't subsume over any of them without sabotaging all your strong buffs. This then only leaves your Noctua, your 1st ability, as a possible subsume slot, and that comes with a pretty obvious implication. If you want to play Dante as a weapons platform into his Exalted Noctua, then you simply cannot use a Helminth ability whatsoever. However, if you want to play him into his caster playstyle, then sure, subsume over your 1st ability. However, here then, your Helminth options again are pretty darn limited. I mean, technically, sure, you can go for whatever you like, but the obvious choice here would be the boring one, and that is Rhino's Roar. And yeah, that is basically all I have to say about Helminth. However though, if you have any other creative ideas and strategies, then make sure to let me know in the comments down below. Whoever says Helminth though also needs to say Archon Shards, and here it very much comes down to which type of build you want to play. If you want to play Dante into his Noctua, his Exalted Tome, then one great option would be the Orange Archon Shards, because they increase your critical chance on secondary weapons, aka on the Noctua. However though, another thing that is very good on Dante is more casting speed. I personally have a sort of hybrid approach, so I can kind of sort of use both playstyles for the video, but if you wanted to go into a caster heavy approach, then it is perfectly fine to just also completely dump everything into yellow and max out your casting speed. It's gonna be pretty darn convenient. Other than that though, red always works, more ability strength, more ability duration, why not? If you want to go into the mixed Archon chart, so to speak, then you could of course also do that, given that you mod your Noctua in a way that it can actually trigger those effects. Let's though take a look at the mods themselves, starting out with the caster-focused playstyle, where we use a whole bunch of our Dark Verse ability and then blow everything up with our ultimate. Let's take a look at the Dante build first, and then afterwards we go over the Noctua, because for the caster build itself, it is very important that you have your Noctua set up right. First of all, even though I just said Noctua modding is important, we subsume over our 1st ability, because it is the caster build, and as I previously said, we just slap Roar on to make our casts even stronger. For the mods themselves, I want to start out with the Aura as well as the Exilus mod. Aura doesn't really matter in my opinion. I personally chose Brief Respite just in case to have a little bit of extra security, so to speak, if my Overguard ever breaks. The Exilus though, on Dante in specific because he is so cast heavy, I would highly recommend going for Preparation. Given the fact that you're going to have Overguard most of the time anyway, that means you don't need Prime Surefooted, the Overguard is going to protect you from the knockdown, and starting your mission with full maximum energy is just so incredibly powerful. The rest of the build then focuses on a whole lot of strength, because more strength means bigger roar buff, it means more damage from your Dark Verse, and in general everything gets stronger. That is why we go for Umbral Intensify, Transient Fortitude, Blind Rage, and Arcane Impetus. Don't worry, Arcane Impetus, we're gonna get back to that in just a second as to why this is so strong. Our energy economy comes with Prime Flow as well as Equilibrium, and I also decided to go for Archon Stretch because A, this build does like to have a little bit more range at least, and given the fact that the Archon version can regenerate a little bit of energy on top, that is definitely nice. If, by the way, you feel that Archon Stretch is strong enough, you might as well drop Equilibrium for literally anything else. Also, because this is the caster build, I decided to go for Natural Talent, which further increases my casting speed. If, for example, you didn't have your Archon Shards mixed like I did, but you go fully into casting speed with just yellow shards, then you wouldn't need Natural Talent, and this would be a flexible mod slot as well. For me though, with just 2 normal yellows, Natural Talent does come in very handy with the caster heavy build. With that said though, let's talk about the Arcanes. First of all, Arcane Truculence. This one is very strong on Dante. See, with Arcane Truculence, whenever you get an increment of 3000 Overguard, which you can do with your second ability very easily, then you will get 10 viral procs onto every enemy in a large AoE around you. We can cast the ability even more, and see here, we have another 3000 increment and they get another 10 viral procs all on top of them. As for the second Arcane, this is now the reason why, even though we subsume over our Tome, the Tome build is still very important. For every unique status effect inflicted with abilities, we gain 6% ability strength as well as 3% ability efficiency. This caps out at a maximum of 13 stacks, so you get a lot of ability strength and also, I think, 39% of ability efficiency once this is maxed out. But then again, how are we gonna trigger 13 different status effects with a kit that inflicts slash and that is it? Well, that depends on our Noctua build. See, even though we subsumed over our Noctua, what we shouldn't forget is that we can still summon our Wordwarden, which is the little Noctua on our left right here. Even though we subsumed over the skill itself, this thing still exists. And whatever this thing does is still scaling with the mods that you have on your Noctua. Whenever it damages enemies and inflicts status effects, then this will stack up our Arcane Impetus, as you can also see in the top right corner of the screen. Currently we're sitting at 9 times, and if we fire a little bit more, now we're at 11, and we can max this out to 13 pretty darn easily. Once this is maxed out, it's no problem to keep this up, because with every cast, you refresh the duration. Even though it's just slash, one cast of our slash refreshes the duration of our Arcane Impetus. But now, how do we get our Noctua to have 13 different status effects? That is all depending on secondary encumber. For every status effect that we trigger, we have a 24% chance to trigger a second random status effect. So all we need to do here is mod one element or so and a bit of status chance onto our Noctua, and then our little Wordwarden companion is going to trigger secondary encumber and therefore Arcane Impetus very darn easily. As for the build, most of it doesn't really matter if you want to go for a purely supportive role. You could, for example, mod Viral onto it, you could leave some mods out to save up on Forma. I personally, though, decided to give it a decent bit of strength, and I decided to mod it all into Electricity, so it can trigger the aforementioned Archon Stretch right here. As you might have noticed, I did not go for some very obvious mods on pistols, like for example Galvanized Diffusion and also the very popular Lethal Turret. That is because, as we mentioned in the skills section, the Wordwarden does not benefit from any multi-shot or fire rate. So this way we can just leave these mods out, they're not going to come in handy with this passive effect. But yeah, you get the point, right? Secondary encumber is the main important factor here for Arcane Impetus, as well as Electricity for our Archon Stretch. The rest, go for whatever you like. However though, if casting abilities is not really your cup of tea and you want to deal the maximum damage possible with your magic book, then this next build is exactly what you need. Let's talk about the damage dealing tome build. Unfortunately, as we mentioned previously, this one right here does not have a Helminth ability because, we just can't. We need all 4. So let's take a look at the builds. In the aura, I went for growing power as it is very easy to trigger and some free ability strength. Also here, preparation, very convenient on Dante because you have a lot of skills to set up at the start of the mission. Similarly to the caster type build, also here we focus on a whole lot of ability strength because more strength means more damage with the Noctua and more goodness with all the other mods that you have. As for the other values, we don't really need range all that much, 100% is perfectly fine, but I did decide to go for a little bit more efficiency with Streamline because that means we're not consuming as much energy when we fire our Noctua right here. What is more interesting though would be the arcanes as well as Archon Vitality. Given that the Noctua is considered a secondary weapon, we go for Arcane Velocity to give it a fat 120% fire rate. The base fire rate on the Noctua is not really that high, so this is a very strong buff. If, however, your Noctua build has fire rate already, then this arcane here is a flex slot. It's kinda sorta interchangeable. And then in the other arcane slot, I went for Arcane Precision. This one gives us 300% base damage to secondary weapons, therefore also a lot more damage for the Noctua. But with this one too, depending on how you set up the build of your Noctua, you might as well want to pick a different arcane, and we're gonna get into that in just a second with some alternative build options between Dante as well as the Noctua. As for Archon Vitality, all I use this for is to double my heat procs with abilities. Reason for all of that would be this build right here. First of all, my Noctua, I build it into pure heat damage, and given that it is an exalted weapon, that means it is an ability, that means it triggers Archon Vitality, that means it doubles its heat procs. Very strong. For even more base damage, we go with Cascadia Flare, which in combination with the heat gives us 480% more damage. For the tome mods themselves, I don't really use anything here because I really want to max out the damage, but I went for a Yahoo Canticle in the Exilus slot because this is a very strong room-wide armor strip, and given that we're going to use our Noctua for the killing anyway, it's just like, it's perfect. It's really darn good. Rest of the build though, pretty self-explanatory, got some fire rate, some multi-shot, crit chance, crit damage, elementalist, as well as faction damage. What is very interesting and complicated though with the Noctua is base damage. And when it comes to base damage, I need to take a little bit of a detour. See, the Noctua is unfortunately pretty darn bugged and inconsistent. For example, base damage mods like Hornet Strike right here do work on the standard fire, however when it fans out and creates these 4 sub-projectiles that then seek out more enemies, those for some reason do not work with Hornet Strike. So instead what we could do is use Galvanized Shot. This damage right here is also base damage, however, these little pellets actually do take into account the damage from Galvanized Shot. So, why don't we use that? Well, we could, but with Galvanized Shot there is another issue. Galvanized Shot on the Noctua works very weirdly. I don't want to go too much into the math because we would have to take a little bit of an intense look at the damage calculation formula, but what it boils down to is that Galvanized Shot sort of always thinks that the Noctua has a base damage of 200 and then scales its damage bonus based on that, which means that all the increased damage from ability strength and all whatnot that the Noctua actually gets, Galvanized Shot just doesn't care about that. So, long story short, yes, Galvanized Shot does work, however you get diminishing returns on ability strength as the ability strength that you have is not really getting buffed by the Galvanized Shot bonus. So, what does that mean for us? Well, it kind of sort of means you can do whatever. You can go for Cascadia Flare for your base damage, you can go for Hornet Strike for your base damage, you can go for Galvanized Shot and then use Secondary Encumber for your base damage. It all kind of sort of works, and you don't really notice all too much of a difference in practice. One thing that I will say though is, If you take Dante beyond base level Steel Path and into longer endurance content, then the Galvanized Shot and Secondary Encumber combination becomes much stronger because now you can actually stack up all those status effects on the enemy. On normal level Steel Path and below, they just die so quickly you can't even stack up your Encumber, and therefore this combination here doesn't do much. However though, we can also do a little bit of an alternative approach to our quote-unquote gunrunner build. What we do here is, we use Arcane Impetus just like with our caster build, where therefore we're getting more ability strength. However, if we use Arcane Impetus, that means we also have to change our Tome build to something like this, where we actually use Secondary Encumber, otherwise Arcane Impetus is not going to get the status that it needs. A third option though would be to not go for any base damage arcanes, but therefore go Secondary Outburst. Secondary Outburst, whole bunch of crit chance, whole bunch of crit damage, very, very strong too. As for the Dante build, here too we have a whole bunch of options again because we don't even need more base damage from Arcane Precision. We could go for something like, Arcane Hotshot. Arcane Hotshot gives us up to 300% more crit chance. Why not, right? We already have heat on our tome, so we can as well trigger it. What I'm basically saying is that when it comes to Dante and the tome, you're free to have so many different combinations. Just, try to mix and match whatever you feel to be most comfortable for your personal gunrunner setup. Oh yeah, and by the way, before I forget it, if you go for the Noctua approach, then one additional thing that I would recommend is using any type of Furax, so either the Furax Wraith, the MK1 or the normal Furax, and combine it with the Amalgam Furax body count mod. This would just give you as a passive buff 45% more fire rate for secondary weapons, and yes, it does work on the Noctua, just a little bit of free fire rate. In combination with that, you can of course always go for a companion with at least 1200 shields, because those companions can then use a reinforced bond and therefore give you another 60% fire rate bonus. Yes, please. And if you haven't already, then also check out my build guide on the brand new Warframe Sirius and Orion right here. Another massive shoutout to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostlenix Gaming, Turtlepeer, Undercarnio2, Skylar Bowser, Mihawki, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Antares, Peter Sader, Boomia1, Mr. Gamesplay, Zave, Awendai, Ezengen, Quax, Henrik5984, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthwield, Everin 8802, Gabriel Tevez, Yaku Ivan Gonzalez, Candy Fox 19, Argentad, GE Schnoz, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.